Francisco Franco, absolute ruler over Spain, was one of the most enigmatic dictators in European history. Even today, the country still bears the scars of his reign.
One of his soldiers, in fact, mocked him when he gave an order, and Franco promptly pulled out his pistol and shot him dead.
He seized power in a bloody civil war and ruled the country with an iron hand for 40 years.
He once said, "I'd have no problem killing half of Spain just to stop it becoming Marxist."
A despot not even his trusted followers could really see through. A man with many faces.
Franco in private, when he was with, I say, friends, if one could call them that, was an absolute blabbermouth. You couldn't shut him up. You know, and of course, once he was in power, no one dared to shut him up.
In 1975, following Franco's death, Spain was a divided country, the legacy of a dictator full of enigmas. But who exactly was this Francisco Franco? In 1936, political unrest plunged the country into chaos, and a great opportunity presented itself for a man whose career seemed to have run its course a long time ago. General Franco instigated a coup which led to a bloody civil war. With the help of Nazi Germany, Franco's troops murdered their way to power. Hitler's air force, the Luftwaffe, used Spain as training for his war of extermination. When hostilities finally ceased, Franco declared himself the new head of state. No one dared contradict the new authoritarian leader, apart, that is, from his dominant wife. She would survive the despot. For more than a century, Spain had ruled the waves as the first superpower of the modern era. But in 1898, in the war against the emerging United States, the Spanish fleet was almost totally destroyed. Spain's naval supremacy was over. The empire crumbled as more and more colonies fought for independence. A once so proud country of discoverers and conquerors slid into military and economic insignificance. A humiliating decline for Spanish self-esteem.
It was a traumatic experience for Spanish society, for its elites, and above all for the establishment. For the armed forces too, especially the Navy.
El Ferrol, on the Atlantic coast, had once been an important military base. It was here, 7 years before the Spanish fleet was annihilated, that Francisco Franco Baumonde was born, the second of 2 children in an officer's family.
As a child on the dockside at El Ferrol, he would have seen the boats arrive, he would have seen the dead being taken off the boats, he would have seen the wounded and the cripples coming up. And this had a tremendous impact on the rest of his life.
The boy grew up in the everyday life of a garrison town, where members of the Navy were a natural part of the scene.
Franco lived in a small, secluded milieu in this garrison town, on the naval base at El Ferrol.
Prior to the defeat in 1898, it was still possible for members of a naval family to believe that they belonged to a great nation with a great navy that was important in the world. And after 1898, it was no longer possible to think that.
A shy boy, Francisco was just an average pupil. He had a strict Catholic upbringing, but his father earned a reputation for being a man about town.
He had a very domineering mother, and he also had a father who was not very present. So I think it's reasonable to suppose that his was not already a happy childhood.
Spain was faced with huge problems. Whereas other countries had long since placed their faith in industrialization, Spain was left lagging behind the modern era. Most of the farmland belonged to big landowners. The gap between rich and poor was growing ever wider.
Ein weiter Teil der spanischen Bevölkerung lebt vom
A large proportion of the Spanish population lived on the land, but under the miserable conditions of day laborers.
Lebensumständen als Tagelöhner.
King Alfonso XIII could not get a grip of the problems. Corruption flourished, while strikes and revolts paralyzed the country. In Catalonia and the Basque Country in particular, calls for independence grew louder. The decline of the Spanish Navy shattered Franco's career dream. It now required very few recruits and took only the best. Franco was turned down. All that remained open to him was the infantry, in the form of the military academy in Toledo.
You know, he was a child when he went to it, and he was, in a way, younger than his age. You know, he was tiny. I think he must have been very unhappy in the military academy.
When unrest broke out in Morocco, Spain was even in danger of losing its last colony. The military was called on to restore order. Franco joined the mission to Africa. When ridiculed by his colleagues for his lack of height, he was only 1.63 meters tall, he reacted with demonstrative severity.
Franco's sister, for instance, once told how he had pressed a red-hot needle down on his wrist. His only comment was that burned flesh smells abominably.
For me, somebody who does not know fear has got serious personality deficiencies. So, yes, Franco probably didn't know fear.
The Morocco mission was characterized by massive brutality. Prisoners on both sides were badly treated. It was on the colonial battlefield that Franco made his mark. At the age of 22, he became the youngest captain in the Spanish army. His hallmark was rigid discipline.
One of the things I think that distinguished him at this time is precisely because he had virtually no interest in sex, he didn't drink, and so while a lot of his colleagues and companions and comrades were coming to terms with the very harsh conditions, with drink, with gambling, with prostitutes, he didn't do any of that.
Instead, Franco spent nights studying maps and planning attacks on rebel settlements, and his approach became increasingly ruthless.
The Africanistas, as they were called, the officers who had their main experience in Africa, were ruthless. Their main job was to terrorize a colonial population, and this was an attitude that they would later bring back to the Spanish Peninsula. So that very much affected Franco, and of course it was where he made what passed for his friendships.
The famous story, of course, is that with his little pot belly and his rather squeaky voice, that one of his soldiers, in fact, mocked him when he gave an order, and Franco promptly pulled out his pistol and shot him dead. I think that the war in Morocco, which was a completely ruthless war and a very savage one, underlined the fact that Franco was a very cold-hearted killer.
After being seriously wounded on the battlefield, Franco was sent back to Oviedo in Spain to recover. There, he was appointed head of the Spanish Foreign Legion. It was in Oviedo that he got to know Carmen Polo. A year later, she became his wife. Carmen was a strict Catholic and soon had major influence over her husband.
You know, he was looking for an advantageous marriage. She was from a rich family. Her family were outraged that she would hook up with a soldier, because the soldier's life in those days with these battlefield promotions was very dangerous. Her father is alleged to say, you know, you can't marry him. It's worse than marrying a bullfighter.
In a diary published a little later, the Africa veteran described his experiences. He wrote of the bold operations carried out by a Spanish battalion and of its courageous leader. But did Franco really have what it takes to be a great commander?
Franco was certainly not a strategic genius. He was very clever when it came to politics, and when it came to, in a Machiavellian sense, when it came to outmaneuvering any rivals, so nobody could challenge him. But as a military thinker or strategist, he was useless.
Franco is the Jurgen Klopp of the military. You know, he's a lucky manager. To be good in football, you've got to be lucky, you know?
In Spain, social tensions were growing. The workers' movement was gaining in power. Conflicts escalated into violence more and more often. King Alfonso and his government seemed paralyzed. The army involved itself in all major issues. Above all, power was in the hands of the elites, rich industrialists, big landowners, and the church. Catholicism was the state religion. Left-wing activists fought against the government and the church.
Whenever political unrest swelled up, priests were killed. But why? What did priests, churches and monasteries have to do with political and military issues? Because of what was seen by the overwhelming majority of the Spanish population as a very close alliance.
King Alfonso gave up and agreed to let the army take control, under the leadership of General Primo de Rivera. He was fascinated by fascism, which was sweeping over the whole of Europe from Mussolini's Italy. Primo de Rivera intended to lead the country out of crisis with the use of violence. Under the military dictatorship, young Francisco Franco's army career took off.
He was the youngest major in the Spanish army. He was the youngest colonel. And above all, he was the youngest general. When he was made brigadier general, Franco was only 33 years old.
And it's also said that one of the reasons why Franco got quick promotion was that he was forever complaining. He was writing to the ministry, demanding to know why he hadn't been promoted. He managed to establish a certain connection with the king, Alfonso XIII.
Now a general, Franco was made head of the new military academy in Saragossa. As a lecturer, he mainly sought the services of officers who, like him, had fought in Morocco.
The training that people received from Franco, well, particularly from the guys he brought in to do the teaching, was not about modern strategy or tactics or modern weaponry. It was about ideology, it was about patriotism, it was about instilling the ideals of the Africanistas.
Through his new post, Franco at last earned the public esteem he yearned for. He was now a local celebrity, and his wife, Carmen Polo, was more than happy to bathe in his success.
That made him one of the top figures in the town, that she loved all of that. You know, she loved hobnobbing with the Archbishop and the mayor and the local authorities. They were the things that mattered.
The couple had a daughter, Carmencita. Rumor quickly spread that it was not Franco who was the father, but his younger brother, Ramon, and that the child's natural mother was not Carmen Polo, but a prostitute.
We have the fact that she was never seen pregnant. We have fairly clear, again, circumstantial evidence that Franco had very little interest in sex, and this may well be to do with the very severe wound that he received in 1916, which was always referred to as a wound in the lower abdomen.
Even the military was unable to get Spain's problems under control. During the world economic crisis of 1930, Primo de Rivera resigned. King Alfonso fled into exile, and Spain became a republic. It was above all the poor who hoped for social progress. The new government announced agricultural reforms. In future, the land was to belong to the farmers. The close ties between church and state were to be severed, and the military deprived of power.
One of the first things that the Republic had to deal with was the fact that it had an army that was bigger than it could afford. Spain was a poor country, and yet it had an army which had a hugely inflated officer corps, and a disproportionate amount of the military budget went on salaries for officers. And the consequence of that was that there was not enough money left for fuel, for vehicles, for modernisation, often they couldn't do manoeuvres because there wasn't enough money for petrol. Soldiers often had to drill with wooden rifles.
The new political goal was for Spain to become a democratic society. The beneficiaries of the old order were afraid of losing their power. So too were conservative Catholics like the Francos. There was much at stake.
The division of state and church met with considerable opposition from the church. The military felt it had been given a back seat through the military reforms. All this was fermenting.
Led by General Sanjuro, the army launched an attempted coup, but it failed. Openly visible in the skies over Europe was the threatening symbol of German fascism. And in secret, numerous Nazi bases were established in the country. Spain's fascists called themselves the Falange Española, a name reflecting the ancient Greek battle order of the phalanx. Its founder was the son of Primero de Rivera, the head of state who had resigned.
It has learned from fascism what fascism has of the idea of unity, authority, and substitution of the struggles among classes by the idea of cooperation.
The young republic was a powder keg. At the next elections, conservative and ultra-right-wing parties emerged victorious. They wanted to abolish democracy again. As a sign of resistance, the communists called for a general strike. But in many places, the call had virtually no effect. Only in the north, in Asturias, did the miners steadfastly oppose the right-wing government. General Franco was called on, and he intended to make full use of the opportunity which presented itself.
I think that Franco's role in the Asturias Rising was definitely his first major public appearance in Spain, and after that, everybody knew his name.
To combat the miners' resolve, the government sent in its special unit, the Foreign Legion, Franco's battle-hardened Africanistas.
And effectively, the Minister of War says to Franco, I haven't a clue about how to deal with this sort of thing. You're in charge. Obviously, you can't be seen to be in charge, but you devised how you want this to be dealt with. Pass me the documents and I'll sign them. And so for a period of 2 to 3 weeks, Franco has what you could call on-the-job training as a dictator.
Franco was convinced that the revolt was being masterminded by the Bolsheviks. In 20 days, resistance in Asturias was brutally crushed. Franco then ordered reprisals against the local population.
There was no necessity, if you like, to take these reprisals, but the bitterness of the soldiers was so great that they basically thought we are in conquered country. And this is the interesting thing about the Army of Africa. They virtually saw Spain itself as a foreign country.
The mercenaries went about their task with such savagery that Franco was soon known as the Butcher of Asturias. Nearly 3,000 people were killed and 30,000 arrested. Many were tortured, mutilated and executed. The general had shown what it meant to oppose him.
So we can certainly say, if not before, by October 1934, Franco is thinking of himself as the saviour of Spain.
As a result of the Asturias Rising, Franco, of course, was almost enemy number one as far as the left was concerned. But of course, as far as the right was concerned, he was seen as the potential saviour even from that particular moment. That is the reason why he was appointed Chief of the General Staff, the most important position in the whole of the army.
And one of the things he does during that time is to start making preparations for a future civil war.
Spain remained politically divided. When new elections were held in 1936, surprisingly, a left-wing coalition, the Frente Popular, emerged victorious. Could democracy survive? Conservatives and the military had long been hatching plans for another coup.
In dieser Situation wurde dem Militär klar,
In this situation, it was clear to the military that unless they took action, they stood no chance, in a democratic way, of stopping a process which was eroding their old interests.
The conspirators were led by General Emilio Mola. Together with other generals, he planned to seize power. But only a few of the conspirators would live to see the new Spain. One of the conspirators, it seems, purposely remained in the background. Francisco Franco Bahamonde. The militarily equipped police force, the Guardia Civil, stood loyally on the side of the Republic. When rumors of the approaching coup began to circulate, the government banished the generals to the provinces. Franco was transferred to the Canary Islands.
And the one thing Franco knew was that you cannot run a coup against the civil guard. And he was actually very, very lucky with the way things worked out, not to be put in jail.
In exile on Tenerife, the neutralized general made himself at home. He learnt English, played golf, and in secret, continued to pull the strings for a coup. The assassination of a right-wing politician in Madrid provided the initial spark. In the capital, violence erupted. The generals believed that their time had come. The coup began on July the 17th in Spanish Morocco. Franco led the rebels in the Canary Islands and wanted to join forces with the Africanistas as quickly as possible. Only the military commander of the Canary Islands, General Amado Balmes, could prevent Franco from doing this, but he had been killed the day before in an alleged hunting accident.
Fue asesinado por orden de Franco.
He was murdered on Franco's orders, and Franco also ordered the subsequent cover-up, a myth to prevent the truth from ever coming to light. That says a lot about Franco, because it reveals his character. He treads carefully, looks ahead, and is cunning, and he has no scruples whatsoever.
Sin escrúpulos.
The next day, Franco flew to Morocco. His aim was to occupy southern Spain with the Africanistas. General Mola's troops advanced from the north. The elected government realized the gravity of the situation and issued a call to arms. Off Gibraltar, warships loyal to the Republic blocked the straits. For the time being at least, Franco's Africanista army was prevented from landing in Spain. Yet his troops in particular were of great importance to the coup.
Of all the various generals with all their various jobs, Franco is the one who is in charge of the one part of the Spanish armed forces that actually works.
But Franco had a plan and good contacts with the Nazis in Germany.
Franco's first contact came before the Civil War, particularly with Admiral Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, who he'd met on numerous occasions. Canaris used to travel frequently to Spain. He was very much of a Hispanophile, and he certainly was keeping contact and realized that Franco was obviously the rising power within the Spanish army and must have sought him out.
¿Quieres decirle algo a los niños alemanes?
¿Pero qué les digo?
Lo que quieras. Anda.
Pido a Dios que todos los niños del mundo no conozcan los sufrimientos y las tristezas que tienen los niños que están aún en poder de los enemigos de mi patria. Yo deseo que todos los niños españoles tengan una casa alegre, con cariño y con juguetes, y por eso envío un beso a todos los niños del mundo.
As an ardent admirer of the composer, every summer Hitler attended the Wagner Festival in Bayreuth. Franco asked two German business friends from Morocco for help. He wanted Johannes Bernhard and Adolf Langenheim to make contact with Hitler. The two members of the National Socialist Party traveled especially to Bayreuth and handed Hitler a personal letter from Franco.
It's certainly true that it was, shall we say, a good moment for them to have gone to see Hitler at Bayreuth, because, of course, Hitler was very emotional during the period of the Wagner season at Bayreuth. And, of course, it was typical that Goering immediately wanted to call the operation Sauberfeuer, purely because of the final act.
Hitler acted immediately. He sent transport aircraft to Morocco and 6 fighter planes as an escort.
Without that air bridge, the coup would have collapsed, so Germany must bear much of the responsibility for the civil war ever erupting.
The rebels were supposed to be led by General Sanjuro, who had been banished to Portugal. But he was killed when his plane crashed on its way to Spain. As a result, Franco took over command of all troops in the south. In the north, General Mola continued to advance. Franco was tasked with taking Madrid. But surprisingly, he changed the plan and sent most of his army to Toledo. The city was firmly in Republican hands. The siege cost Franco several weeks, but in the end, he was able to take the Alcazar, the historic fortress.
And that was vital in the world of the nationalists, because the Alcazar was seen almost as a symbol of Republican survival and of bravery and sacrifice. So that was the vital moment for him to prepare his leadership bid to have total control of the nationalist movement.
His Toledo triumph made Franco popular, and he used that popularity for propaganda for his own ends.
La semilla de nuestro patriotismo regada con la sangre de tantas mártires hará fecunda la cosecha, de la cual las mejores espigas las hemos de depositar en el altar augusto de la patria.
Franco appealed, if you like, to the nationalist audience, the beatas, the very religious women, the middle class, those who were terrified of communism, socialism, because they thought that he was the most ruthless and definitely the most determined of all the generals. And that is almost certainly true.
Hitler and Mussolini had long since realized how useful another fascist state in Europe could be. But money and weapons would only be provided on one condition.
The Germans and the Italians did not want to negotiate with various commanders on the battlefield. They wanted just one contact person, and that was Franco.
The rebels made Franco their generalissimo, the commander-in-chief of the army.
Thanks to the thousands of souls who followed our movement in defense of civilization. Thanks to all those countries who passed through our some troubles and are now offering to us their sympathy and their moral support, and thanks to all those who created work to spread them all over the world. Country, religion, family, this is our aim and strength.
The Civil War was now raging. Throughout the country, Franco's nationalist rebels were openly supported by the old upper class.
After the coup, the big landowners, the bankers, the entrepreneurs, and the church all regained their old positions.
Nach dem Putsch der Militärs wiedererlangt.
On the side of the Republic, a left-wing alliance of socialists, communists, and anarchists stood united against big money. Socialist groups urged workers to take control of their places of work. Factories were occupied and their owners locked up or even shot. Profits from labor were no longer to end up solely in the pockets of the rich. Agricultural workers also revolted and fought for the collectivization of farmland. The unrest in Barcelona alone cost 400 lives, and often the fronts were blurred. The battles between hostile groups were never ending.
I think all of the generals expected the war would last a couple of weeks. Franco, I think, was one of the few who thought that it would last longer. Now, that's not to say he thought it would last 3 years, but he was more cautious than the others.
For some time now, the most diverse groups had also been fighting alongside Franco. Thousands took up arms. Monarchists who wanted to see King Alfonso back on the throne, Carlists who wanted a Bourbon as regent, and the Falange Española who glorified fascism.
Franco really ignored the Falange up until the outbreak of the Civil War. One must remember that even in the elections of February 1936, the Falange achieved no more than about 1,000 votes per province in Spain. Its strength, funny enough, came after the start of the Civil War, when José Antonio Primo de Rivera was already in prison. He had already been arrested by the Republican government.
Franco saw that the armed fascists could be very useful to him. In April, he declared the Falange to be the official state party and placed himself at its head. As they marched on Madrid, the rebels destroyed everything in their path, even if it was of no military importance.
He once said, "I'd have no problem killing half of Spain just to stop it becoming Marxist." He really said that.
Thousands of corpses paved Franco's way to power.
I mean, even the Germans were shocked and the Italians were shocked at times by the cruelty he showed.
There's one point where he says to the Italian ambassador, Mussolini's ambassador, "I have to conquer Spain square centimetre by square centimetre because I have to control the people who live on the land." When Hitler talks of 1,000-year Reich, for Franco, that's short-term thinking.
Every potential opponent was arrested or disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Federico García Lorca, one of Spain's most famous poets, also fell victim to the systematic cleansing. His body was simply buried by the roadside. Lorca's murder, and that of thousands of other civilians, was seen far beyond Spain's borders as a symbol of the barbarity of the Civil War. The world was shocked as it learned more and more about the carnage. It was also a war of pictures. The major news agencies sent their best reporters to Spain. Like photographer Robert Capa. His picture of the falling soldier became an icon of the 20th century. A German correspondent also reported from Spain. Herbert Frahm reported on the Civil War for several newspapers. He had fled from the Nazi dictatorship, initially to Norway, and had only recently changed his name. He now called himself Willy Brandt.
The Spanish Civil War had an extraordinary emotional appeal right across the world. So from that point of view, it seemed to symbolize the great clash of a whole generation.
Nazi Germany and Italy had already officially recognized Franco as Spain's head of government, even though his forces had still not taken Madrid. And the Republicans were being reinforced by the international brigades, volunteers from all over the world. Many had communist leanings, and few had ever held a weapon before.
Their motivation was to stop the advance of fascism in Europe. Spain was on its way to becoming a new fascist state.
The Spanish Civil War was everybody's fight, and that became apparent very, very quickly.
The ranks of the left-wing fighters included prominent intellectuals, like writers Ernest Hemingway and George Orwell, and eminent documentary filmmaker Joris Ivens from the Netherlands. In Spain, Ivens spent months filming in the theatres of war. His documentary became an international indictment of fascism. Ivens provided a different perspective from that of Frankist propaganda. He showed the sheer horror of the Civil War. His documentary from the perspective of the Spanish people is still regarded as a masterpiece. And what position did the other countries in Europe take with regards to events in Spain? In London, a non-intervention committee was set up. As members, even Germany and Italy claimed to be neutral, yet they had long been playing a role in Spain. Hitler's most important contribution to the victory of the Frankistas was now coming from the air.
General Franco ruft die gesunden Kräfte zur Abwehr des Bolschewismus, zur Rettung des Vaterlandes auf. Das nationalsozialistische Deutschland unterstützt ihn beim Kampf gegen den übermächtigen Feind und seine internationalen Helfer. Auf dem schnellsten Wege werden Kriegsmaterialien und die ersten deutschen Freiwilligen, der Grundstock der späteren Legion Condor, in Sonderflugzeugen nach Spanien überführt.
The Condor Legion was a special unit of the German Air Force, under the command of Wolfram von Richthofen. Its existence was officially denied right up to 1939. Yet the Germans had already provided crucial assistance with Franco's air bridge at the start of the coup.
It basically has the top technology available, and it makes a big difference. He has the covert help of London, which prevents the Republic arming itself. And he has a lot of help from Mussolini. There's 80,000 Italian troops. He could have won the war very quickly.
But Franco persisted with his tactic of gaining control of the country meter by meter.
Comments were made by Mussolini and Wolfram von Richthofen, who were tearing their hair out at this unnecessarily slow and exhausting approach by Franco. Franco doesn't know how to wage war. Franco is no military strategist. He's incapable of fighting a war.
Or did the Generalissimo know exactly what he was doing? Franco had already taken the south and stabilized his front outside Madrid. Now he advanced into northern Spain. In April 1937, his troops set their sights on the Basque town of Guernica. Guernica had been a holy place for the Basques and a symbol of their independence ever since the 14th century. A bridge in the center of town was seen as being of strategic importance to the Republicans. Allegedly, when Franco called for the German bombers, the bridge was to be the sole target. The Condor Legion dropped some 30 tons of bombs on the town, killing around 300 of its citizens. Luis Iriondo was 14 years old at the time of the bombing raid. He lost relatives and friends. His brother was traumatized for life. When the first bombs fell, Luis had just enough time to find safety.
The shelters weren't even finished. There was no light, no ventilation. I could scarcely breathe. We sat on the floor. The day before, I'd been given some new trousers, and my mother warned me not to get them dirty. After 15 minutes, someone said, "It's over." But as soon as we left the shelter, the bells started ringing again. The first planes have bombed the bridge, we thought, and now other aircraft are coming to bomb the town.
Incredibly, in the end, the bridge remained intact, whereas the entire town was in flames. 80% of the buildings had been destroyed.
Every Monday, a popular farmers' market was held in Guernica, and that is precisely when it all happened. That is why they chose the Monday for their bombing raid. They knew there would be more people there.
And it's quite clear, I mean, if you look at the Tagebuch of Richthofen, he makes it absolutely clear what it was all about. It was an act of terror.
Von Richthofen wrote, Guernica, a town of 5,000 inhabitants, literally razed to the ground. The start of the blaze and the collapse of several buildings was very interesting to observe. The negligible fire brigade presence brought from San Sebastián was powerless. There was a perfidious purpose behind the seemingly indiscriminate bombing. For the German Air Force to practice under real conditions for Hitler's forthcoming war. Much of what happened in the Basque Country was repeated later in Poland. For Hitler, Guernica was nothing more than training for the Second World War.
I don't think that Richthofen had any idea of the symbolic importance of Guernica to the Basques and all the rest of it. As far as he was concerned, I think that it was just basically an exercise in aerial terror.
German aircraft also bombed churches to test the impact on solid stone buildings. But the German pilots had little sympathy for Franco and his movement.
There was an atheistic aspect to National Socialism, and many Germans were not happy that the government was fighting for clerics and big landowners. Over a beer or a glass of wine in the evening, it's alleged people would comment, "Actually, we're fighting for the wrong side."
In reaction to the bombing, Picasso painted Guernica. Shown at the 1937 World Fair in Paris, the work became world famous as a symbol of the suffering of the Spanish people.
Guernica is the first total destruction of an unprotected town in the history of warfare.
Franco had outlived all his rivals. The founder of the fascist movement, Primo de Rivera, was executed by the Republicans. Many of the former co-conspirators had fallen into enemy hands and been killed. Only General Mola could still have contested his claim to power in Spain. But he died in an air crash in 1937. The cause of the accident has never been established. The province of Aragon in the north was one of the few regions still held by the Republicans. Resistance was strongest in Belchite. Franco deployed all his military forces there. They attacked the town for 2 weeks. Finally, Belchite was destroyed and Aragon fell. Franco now held virtually the whole of Spain. his triumph seemed almost certain. But it was not until July 1938 that the decisive battle took place. On the Ebro, a river in southwest Catalonia. Franco himself took part in the battle, one of the longest and most brutal of the entire war. In the end, it is said the river ran red with blood.
The decisive factor in the war was undoubtedly the total air superiority of the Franquistas, thanks to the intervention of the Condor Legion. So it is no exaggeration to say that without German and Italian, but primarily German intervention, Franco would probably not have triumphed in the Civil War.
What was still missing were the cities. For months, Franco laid siege to Madrid and Barcelona. Cut off from the outside world, their citizens starved. And for weeks on end, the two cities were bombed nearly every day.
The next day, Franco arrived. His troops marched into Barcelona. I can still remember it quite clearly. We could see them coming from a distance. We could still have opened fire, but it would have been pointless. The Republicans had already left.
En el día de hoy, cautivo y desarmado el Ejército Rojo, han alcanzado las tropas nacionales sus últimos objetivos militares. La guerra ha terminado.
The cost? 500,000 dead, through warfare and terror. But how could so much suffering and death be compatible with the Christian faith of Franco and his strictly Catholic wife?
We have anecdotes to the effect that when people who knew her interceded with her, asking her to talk to Franco to stop someone being executed or so on, that she would say, you know, Paco's far too busy to be interrupted with something like this, that she did nothing, as far as we know, to soften or to limit his ruthlessness.
After 3 years of civil war, the small boy from El Ferrol was ruler of Spain. Franco had achieved his goal, but his reign of terror was only just beginning.